And okay, welcome to week 7 of Summer Smasher Masterclass series. And today we have, and please tell me if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, Yin He.
That's perfect.
Yeah, she is an amazing AWS connection. As you know, the Garage has really great resources through Amazon Web Services. We provide our team a bunch of credits when they get residency. And also we get great connections. So she comes through that. She has experience in the startup world herself, having been on a startup for 6+ years in healthcare. It was a biotech team, if that's right.
Yep.
Stratios, am I saying that right?
Yes.
Okay, and you were doing stuff in operations. I mean, that's startup life, right? I'm sure you were wearing like every hat available to you for those 6 years. And then on top of that, now she's doing some stuff in the investment side of bio, med tech startup teams and healthcare teams. And so now she's kind of seeing not just how the sausage gets made, but how I guess it gets paid. Anyway, I'm going to pass it on to you now, Yin, to give yourself a much better intro than I ever could, and take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Arcelia, for having me here. And thanks to everyone that's here and, spending the next hour with me. So as Arcelia mentioned, I have a few slides today for talking about the healthcare and life sciences landscape, but, I'd love for this to be, much more of a conversation. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. Happy to answer them. I also have some time scheduled at the end for Q&A. But again, it's always way more fun to have a conversation than to listen to myself speak. All right, so I'll go ahead and share my screen now. Okay. Hopefully you guys can see all of that. Arcelia, maybe you can just let me know.
Great.
Okay,
yep.
wonderful. Great. Awesome. All right, let me move the chat window. Okay. Great. So today, I am here to talk about some of the technologies that currently exist in the healthcare and life sciences space. Ultimately for advancing patient care, right? People that are in this space, what we really care about is how do we improve the human condition? How do we think about patients being at the core and the center of everything we do? In terms of better treatments, lowering cost, and improving that journey as a patient. So this is just a really, very simple agenda. First, I'll do a little bit of introduction into my background, a little bit more details. Arcelia did a really great job. Next, we'll talk about, some of the challenges that we currently see in this space, right? And given these challenges, where are some of the gaps? And then how can technologies provide some of the solutions? And then I'll dive deeper into the technologies. There are 3 buckets that I thought were really interesting to highlight and surface. First is cloud computing, the second is lab automation, and lastly, machine learning. So I'll briefly talk about, what each of these technologies are, what they do, but focusing mostly on the real world, real life applications, right? It's always way more interesting to kind of talk about, the companies and some of the really cool stuff that's being done in this space, especially made more relevant with the current condition that we're in with COVID. And then I'll end with just, a slide on some of the impacts that we're currently seeing with COVID-19, right? How has that impacted the startup community, the ecosystem? And then lastly, I got a hint that a few weeks ago, my colleague presented on AI/ML, and, she had a slide on how to think about breaking into the industry that was really popular. So, just a few sort of hacks and tips and tricks on if you are thinking about building your own healthcare life sciences startup, what are some of the things you should know and can take from this talk. Right. Okay, so a little bit about me. So I started my career in the lab. So I was a bench scientist, and I love science so much. I went on to get my PhD in molecular biology and genomics at Cornell. And so for my thesis, I was studying, this protein folding pathway, and I was really interested in identifying regulators of this pathway that could be, therapeutic targets. And I was studying this pathway in the context of metabolic disorders, so type 2 diabetes and obesity. And I was thinking, how can some of this research be translated, right, into actual drug discovery and development? From there, from academia, I really wanted to kind of get into industry to learn more about the work that was being done there. And so I had this amazing opportunity to join a really early stage company in the Bay Area. And so I moved out there. I was a really early employee, the second scientist at a company. It's now known as Stratios. It was formerly known as Transcriptic and underwent a merger. But there, I held many different roles and wore many different hats, right, as you do in a startup, ranging from strategy and business development to thinking about the science and the technology, and even, selling the software into larger biotech and pharma companies. And so there I really, discovered kind of my love for working at this intersection, right, of having this really deep science expertise, but then thinking about how can I merge that with some of, the technology that currently exists, right, and operating at that intersection in that space. So I was there for about, 6.5 years, and which is a really long time in the startup world. And so, an opportunity popped up to join the startup team at AWS, the cloud computing arm of Amazon. I kind of jumped at it. And so there I'm on, a startup team, but specifically focusing on the healthcare life sciences verticals. So I work with, our partners, I work with early stage founders, I work with startups and, accelerators, incubators in this space. Really trying to create this community and this ecosystem and thinking how can we better support some of the companies that are in this space, not just through offerings that are available, right, through AWS, but, through my personal experience, operating in an early stage startup environment and thinking how I can share, that advice so other founders can leverage that as they're building their companies. And in my free time, I love traveling, which there's none of that now. Love doing some yoga. And interestingly, I've been doing some reading and came across this really interesting book called Invisible Women. So given that this talk is about technology and data, it's a really interesting book that focuses on exposing data bias in a world where, most of the data is actually collected on men, right? And so this is the data that's being used to make and guide decisions, across things like, building roads and infrastructure and bus schedules, right? So all of the things that impact our day-to-day. So it really shows, surfaces potential biases in the data that we all need to be on the lookout for. And also my quarantine hobby has been taking up origami. I've always really been bad at kind of visualizing things in 3D. And so this is actually something that I'm finding to be a lot of fun. So I hope you guys are all during this time, finding additional hobbies and time, to spend with family and loved ones as well. All right. Great. So the healthcare and life sciences industry, right, the observation has been that it's, traditionally been really slow to adopt new technologies. But, there are lots of challenges and gaps in which technology can provide solutions in this space. And so, I think this is an area where there's really a lot of potential for innovation, and that's what makes it really exciting. And so what do I mean by this? So here, if you look at what it was like to be a scientist, right, say back in the 1930s, these are images I took from Cold Spring Harbor, which is a really, leading research institution, not just in the US, but in the world. It's been home to 8 Nobel laureates. What you see on the bottom, right, are, kind of peeking into a lab, right? What are scientists doing in the 1930s? Okay, they're sitting at a bench, they're looking through microscopes, they're doing some manual work, right? They're probably collecting that information manually and doing some analysis to inform them on the next set of experiments to do, right? Okay, all great. If you fast forward 80 years, right, what do you see? So here is the Crick Institute that was built in London in 2016. It's one of the biggest biomed research centers in Europe. It won an award for planning excellence, and it's actually even home to a 2019 Nobel Prize recipient. So this is sort of the creme de la creme, right, of biomed research institutes. So on the top, what you can see is obviously it's a beautiful building, right? Very modern, all glass. But if you go inside and look at the labs, what you see is really surprising, right? In that it kind of looks like what's on the left, right? There's still a scientist sitting at the bench, right? Doing manual work. In this case, she's pipetting. She may be surrounded by newer, technologies that can help, speed up what she's doing, but the gist of what she's doing is the same, right? There's no difference. And that's really surprising, right? In 80 years, where is the innovation, right? Where, how can we use technology to change some of this? And, similarly, right, this is a scientist, but similarly, you can think of this as going to a doctor as well, right? You're still going in. You still have lots of manual interactions. The doctor is, they may be sitting at a computer typing, but they're still recording a lot of notes manually. And in contrast, right, to other industries, what are we seeing, right? So, on the left, you're seeing a car assembly line for Teslas, right? You see tons of robots, right? In all these other industries, we're seeing software and automation take off and work alongside humans to accelerate and extend the process, right? In the middle, we're seeing Amazon fulfillment centers in which there are robots, right, that are picking different things from your Amazon cart, right, and preparing them to be shipped to you. And on the right, you see, Autodesk, which is they make a CAD software tool, right, for engineering and construction. And you can see that, architects are able to model out what they're going to build instead of building it. Whereas in science, right, we don't really have great models, right? We still have to do the experiment to see the outcome, to do the next set of experiment, right? And that really long experimental iteration cycle really slows things down. So why do we care about this, right? Like, why do we care that in healthcare and life sciences, right, things haven't been, as technologically savvy, or, these technologies haven't really been readily adopted? Well, if you look at the US healthcare spend, right, it's, more than 17% of GDP. That amounts to over, right, $10,000 per person, every single person in this country. And the year-over-year growth is really unsustainable. And so, if you kind of look at the breakdown, right, this is due to things like really high drug prices. We're seeing things like higher salaries for doctors and nurses, but we're also seeing, higher hospital administration costs, right, and with higher prices for many medical services. So these are all areas of opportunities, right, where we can think about how can we leverage some of the technologies that we have along with new innovation to think about changing that process. So, in thinking about the space, right, where are some of the challenges, right? So the first is that things are really, right, take a really long time. And with that, it becomes really expensive. So one example is, is drug discovery, right? It costs about, on estimate, $1 billion and over 10 years to develop a drug and get it to FDA approval to the point where it can be administered to patients, right? And one example that we've seen fast track during COVID is this drug remdesivir, right, that has been developed by Gilead, and they're pricing it at, $3,000 for a 5-day course. And that cost, a lot of it is due to the really high costs and, slow development times in the drug discovery process. So the second challenge is, a lot of the processes, the people and the data are in silos, right? So they're not fully integrated. They're not able to cross collaborate really easily. And one example of this that we see is in the electronic health records, right, is a lack of interoperability. So if you go see a doctor, they're part of a medical system. That medical system uses a specific software to process your medical data, right? Say you need to go see a specialist now and you need to go to another hospital group, right, that's using a different software to manage your data. Those two systems, don't necessarily talk to each other, right? And so now you either have to have a lot of manual intervention, right, in order to get the data in the same place, or even worse, right, you may have to repeat those tests, right, in order to repeat that information that existed in the other data. So how can we make systems much more interoperable so that they can talk to each other and easily integrate? The next challenge in this space is that there's still a lot of manual interventions, right? And we all know that, though humans are good for certain things, they're not great, right, when it comes to really highly repetitive, tedious tasks. And we can be extremely error prone, and even worse, not even recognize that errors have been made, right? So examples of this are, in what I showed you in the previous slide, right? Scientists, typing up some of their data manually, right? Or doctors transcribing medical notes manually. And the worst part about this is that, yes, there's a manual component, but once manually generated data, again, is not really prime for interoperability, right? Because the way that I write something and the way that someone else writes something, it's not going to be in the same structure or format. And we'll talk about this when we get into machine learning, right? But it makes it really challenging then for us to use automation or software to learn from these types of processes that have had a lot of manual intervention. And the last, big challenge in this space is that, there's a lot of really complex regulatory and compliance landscape, right? And this is important, right? Because we need to ensure that, drugs and processes and software, and everything that's developed in this space is safe, right? And efficacious because they're treating humans. This isn't just, you're building, say, a gaming app, right? And there's a bug in your software. And yes, it's probably annoying if, something happens while you're playing this game, but there isn't as high of a cost, right, as in messing up, say, a medication or a safety component. And we're seeing this play out right now in the COVID vaccination as well, right? A lot of people are pushing for the vaccine to be developed faster and faster. And though there are advancements that technology can bring, a lot of the steps, right, are put in place really to make sure that things developed are safe for patients and for humans. So I talked about some of the challenges, right? And so, again, these are kind of the three buckets of technology that I think can really provide solutions in this space. So the first is, cloud computing, cloud infrastructure. The second is thinking about much more lab automation, so moving things away from manual work, right, to automating them. And then lastly is machine learning and the benefits of that. So Arcelia, before I dive into kind of each of these technologies, are there any questions?
I certainly have some questions, but I'll open it up to the group first. Does anyone have any questions from the group? Okay, so my first question is, so you were mentioning how, in healthcare, there's a very slow adoption rate, which I think has been discussed before with our students. And for instance, one of the teams that we have, and sorry for the background noise, one of the teams at the garage actually launched their device internationally to kind of, I guess, just be able to validate the product without any of the FDA clearance that they needed here in the States to be able to start providing it to hospitals. And they had a very successful launch in India. And then after that, after their operations were essentially just giving them revenue and working really well, they decided to come and launch in the US. And so that was like a very strategic way to handle this kind of long haul of that slow adoption process. Do you have any other advice to students who might be interested in being a startup in healthcare who understand that it's going to be a slow adoption and kind of a difficult journey in that way, and something like they can do to mitigate that?
Yeah, that's a great lead in actually into the first technology, which is using cloud computing, right? And I'll talk a little bit more in detail, but what the cloud infrastructure gives you, right, are sort of best practices and reference architecture and compliance eligible services out of the box, so that you can focus, right, on your differentiated product and start, building that instead of thinking about, do I need to be HIPAA eligible, et cetera, from day one, right? So we'll definitely discuss that, but that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, compliance is absolutely one of the reasons why this process can take so long, in the US and potentially other countries. But I do think, sort of the US is, setting sort of the precedent of what it means to, make sure that you have compliance infrastructure in place. I do know, like we were talking to a company in India, right? And even though they may not necessarily be liable to the same, say HIPAA compliance, right? If you're dealing with protected health information and making sure that, you're protecting the information of the patients or your clients, they know that it's coming. right, even in India. And so they, wanted to make sure that as they're building things in AWS and in the cloud, that they are keeping that in mind and building for the future, right? Rather than, you can certainly take shortcuts up front, and that's a business decision, right? Sometimes, you need to get to a certain milestone really quickly, and that's fine. But there are absolutely other considerations, right? If you have to backtrack, right, later on in order to meet those compliance requirements, that can have, impacts on the business as well.
Sure.
So we try to educate around that and just, provide understanding around what are the trade-offs you're making.
I guess that's a great answer. Thank you. And I'm sure you'll get more into detail about all of the different ways that technology can solve some of those problems, especially cloud. Would you say out of the three that you mentioned, cloud, lab, automation, and machine learning, which of them do you think are going to be have the biggest impact soonest? Which one is the wave that would be a good one to jump on if you were a startup in the healthcare realm?
Yeah, so I think when you look at these technologies, they're kind of presented as separate ones, right? But really, they're kind of different layers, right? I almost drew them as kind of a pyramid, right? So cloud is really the infrastructure, right? Cloud has nothing to do with, if you're life sciences or healthcare or fintech, right? It really is thinking about how do you have, on-demand, unlimited access to IT resources, right? And that's, that's a kind of a business decision. And I would say that everybody, has need for cloud, right? Lab automation is something that's a little bit more specific, right? But automation in itself is also, kind of a general process, right? If you are deploying cloud, you will likely have the benefits of automation as well, right? Because there's going to be services there that you can, link together and automate in order to do that. And then, I think machine learning is the one with kind of the most amount of hype right now. So the only thing I would say there is I think it's a really valuable tool. I think it's still not completely proven. We'll talk about some of the use cases, right? And kind of some early examples of where machine learning has really been impactful in this space. But I would just, caution people against the hype, right? And we always say, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And do you need machine learning, right? Rather than, hey, I'm going to use machine learning to solve X.
Sure, like a band. Okay, so
exactly.
I have one more question, which is it was a little bit about that error-prone way that healthcare operates, and the fact that so much is human error. I've from my experience, startups have a really hard time selling a technology that highlights the errors of the technician or the errors of the doctor, because you're essentially trying to sell and get buy-in to something that is essentially a solution that creates friction with the actual problem, which could be human error. And there's I don't know, maybe a gap of accepting that solution, because you don't want to face the fact that there's 70 or 80% human error in patient. I mean, in what is it called? Why am I blanking? When you do a scan, a technical scan of someone's brain, a radiologist, right?
Yeah.
So there are all these areas in healthcare where there are opportunities for technology to kind of offset some of those human errors. But at the same time, you have to get those technicians to adopt these technologies, which means that they have to confront the errors that they're how would you, I guess my question is, how do you help a startup to navigate those conversations, knowing that there is kind of this negative reaction to solving problems technically that are formed from human error?
Yeah, I mean, I think human error is well accepted, and actually radiology and medical imaging is one of the primary use cases right now of machine learning in healthcare and life sciences. So I think there's growing acceptance of that, right? So where I've seen success is really, if you can present your solution as a way to augment, right, the human in the process, not to replace it, right? Because none of us, want to feel like, hey, we're easily replaceable. But if you can sell it as a way to extend the capability of the human, and that it frees up the human to do, more either nuanced or, kind of high intelligence things, right? Because, AI and machine learning is still at a place where it's good with doing a lot of redundant stuff, right? But it's not at the point where it's really AI, right? In terms of artificial intelligence, it still requires, right, a lot of training and hand-holding, right? So I would say, sell your solution, and it's true, right? And that is really augmenting that of the human and not replacing. And honestly, if you kind of get down into it, like nobody wants to be doing these repetitive tasks, right, that these solutions are solving, right? But a lot of selling, right, is you have to have emotional intelligence, right? We're in this, right, kind of environment where nobody wants to feel like, they're replaceable. But, so how do you transition that, your selling point into, again, just augmenting that of the human and freeing the human up to do, other types of work, right, that aren't suited for machines right now.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So let's move on to cloud computing. So as I mentioned, cloud computing is the on-demand delivery of IT resources with pay-as-you-go pricing. And so a really good analogy to think of this for people that aren't familiar with it is, think of electricity, right? When you come home, you turn on the light, you pay for what you use. When you leave your house, you turn it off. You don't pay for it anymore. It sounds really simple, right? But of course, we all understand there's this really complex, underlying electrical grid infrastructure that is built to help us leverage all of that. And so that's what cloud is, right? But for your computer, right? So, every time, say you go into, you open your Excel, right, to do some sort of computational work. Imagine if you had unlimited access, right, to that ability to do computation. And that in itself is really game changing for healthcare life sciences, right? Especially because the space traditionally has been extremely over constrained in a sense. Okay, so if we move on to some of the benefits of the cloud, if we think back to some of the challenges, right, one of them was data silos, right, or silos of people or information or knowledge not being easily accessible and shared. So now if all the data is in the cloud, it's actually accessible by anyone from anywhere, right, that you want to have access to that data. So it's been great, for removing data silos, for creating, what we call a single source of truth to large amounts of data and to a single data source that can be used for analytics and to provide insights. The second thing is that you're going to get a lot of cost savings, right? And this is always important in the business. You're now dealing with economies of scale and on-demand access, right? As mentioned with electricity, you're only paying for what you use. And that's exactly what you're getting from cloud computing as well. If you have a project that's really compute intensive, you can spin up a couple instances, use it. When you're done with that project, you turn it off and you're no longer paying for it. So it allows you to be extremely flexible and also allows you to, even potentially test, right, ideas that, previously you wouldn't think of testing. And, Arcelia, this is something that we discussed, right, is compliance, right? So, AWS has reference architectures and best practices, right, for similar solutions that people have used, for compliance, right, whether it's for HIPAA or for GXP or, medical device, FDA 501(k) approval. AWS has tons of services that are, eligible for compliance, and we have technical resources on our end that can help you think about how to model that architecture. And then lastly, as I mentioned, what's really game changing is this unlimited access to compute power and data storage, right? Science, again, has typically been really constrained, and by nature, right, even the experiments that we do are biased in a sense because, we only have, right, if anyone's who's done bench science, right, you have plates, right, that are, 24, 96, 384. So I remember, in grad school, right, because I only had 384, I had to do a certain number of replicates. I would be very cognizant, right, of which, specific reactions or variables I was testing because it was limited. And so that in itself, right, is biasing the research, and it's a completely different world if I didn't have to think about, right, which experiments I could do, but what if I wanted to test, right, all of the different variables and the combinations. And so, kind of two examples in this space that I'll give. The first is Moderna. So Moderna is, they develop a messenger RNA platform. And, for those of you following the COVID-19 in the news, they're actually developing one of the leading candidates for a COVID-19 vaccination. And so what's really unique and exciting about Moderna is it kind of changes, right, the paradigm of how drugs are being discovered, right? So if you remember back to your molecular biology days, right, the central dogma is, you have DNA that goes to mRNA that goes to protein. So previously, right, a lot of work was being done on DNA. Moderna, right, started, was the first company to use mRNA as a platform to develop drugs. Okay, so the second example is, Butterfly Network, right? And so they bring medical imaging to people in more places. So they have this device that you can see here, and it's really cool. It's one of the first handheld whole body ultrasound systems. And you can see, right, it's about the size of your cell phone, and it only costs about $2,000. So this makes it, universally accessible and affordable, right? So previously, if you're in a hospital, you needed to get, say an MRI, right? You would either have to get, moved to another room or have this really cumbersome device. This really puts the hands of medical imaging, right, in the hands of almost, right, any doctor or nurse in a room. Imagine you're in a remote area treating patients, right? You may not have access to the most sophisticated or up-to-date technology, and this really changes that, right? So you can leverage, uses artificial intelligence in the background for some of the imaging, but this really allows more democratized access to devices and care. Okay. So the second technology area I'll talk about is lab automation. So some of the benefits of, lab automation, right, is it allows you to do higher throughput, right? Humans, even though if you work 24 hours a day, 7 hours a day, right, there's only so much you can do. But lab automation, what it allows you to do is you can go from, say, processing hundreds of samples, right, to maybe even thousands or tens of thousands of samples a day. And again, if we bring this back to COVID-19, right, testing throughput is one of the biggest issues right now. And so, lab automation, right, people are setting up automated labs to think about how can we, again, increase the number of testings that we can do per day. Another benefit of lab automation is that, you're going to get much more enriched data sets, right? Because now you're using robots and devices, right, to execute instead of, humans who aren't great, right, at remembering, some of the mistakes they made or they may not even realize, right? Robots are able to transmit and provide a lot more information. And so this is all really good data that you can capture to provide much more transparency into the process, right? And also if something goes wrong, right, you can try to go back and figure out why. With lab automation, you're automatically going to get improved data reproducibility, right? And so what this means is that if you do the same, assay over and over and over again, the variability between that is going to be very low, right? That's because you've programmed the robots to do, exactly that. So we used to have a joke that, if a robot makes a mistake, at least it will make the mistake reproducibly, right? So even if you accidentally program the robot to, pipette 10 microliters instead of 1, right? That data, even though it may not recapitulate, the actual intent of the protocol, you will still see reproducibility, right? Because that robot's been told what to do. And then lastly, what's really cool is you can get programmatic, specificity. And so what this means is, this is the previous company I was working for, but Stratios had a cloud lab to power on-demand automated discovery in the drug development and synthetic biology space. And so one of the, unique things that we were developing was not just on the lab automation side, right, but how do you program robots in such a way that was really intuitive so that scientists could do it, right? And you didn't require automation engineers, right, that knew how to code. So we started thinking about, I'm not sure how many people have done work in the lab, right? But protocols are generally just PDFs or Word documents, right, of simple English, like pipette this into that, centrifuge this, etc., right? And of course, if I write it or someone else writes it, it's going to be very different, right? Again, you don't have that interoperability because, right, we're two humans writing different things based on our interpretation of what's happening. So, Auto Protocol, if you're interested in this at all, this is an open standard for thinking of protocols, similarly as software code, right? Not PDFs. And so, what this allows you to do is to, again, have reproducibility, right? So if you're going to have protocols as code and the robots are executing against that code, they are going to be doing the same thing every single time, and even if they're not going to be making those mistakes. And so once you start thinking about codifying protocols, what you get is kind of this cycle, right, of design, execute, and analyze. An analysis from that data set can then programmatically, using code, go back to inform the next set of design, so that ultimately you have this experimental, right, cycle, experimental iteration that is completely automated, right? So you don't need humans except at the beginning, right, potentially to input some of the samples, et cetera. You just let the systems go. And so here, I hope this plays, but it's just wanted to show really quickly, a video, right, of what this looks like.
Is it okay that there's no sound? Okay. Yin?
Yes.
We don't hear it. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay. I just wanted you guys to see it. Yeah, I was probably the only one hearing that. And so what's really cool is that, there isn't just one of them, right? One of these labs, right? Labs and research, some of the major pharma companies, right? Biotechs all around the world are thinking about how can they use automation, right? To transform what we're doing. So that, right, you guys can see is really different than the pictures I showed earlier of a scientist sitting at a bench. And so it's really exciting to see, that kind of transition and progress being made. And then lastly, for automation, something else, Viome is another company that's building a really cool digital platform, but this is actually for live animals research, right? So for translational research. So in the drug discovery cycle, when you have a compound that you think, right, has the right properties and could be a really good potential drug that, is approved by the FDA, one of the last steps before moving into clinical human trials is you test it out on animals, right? And so previously, as you can imagine, this is extremely manual, right? Being able to document, some of the behaviors of the animals to get that data. And so Viome has this platform where you can see these racks of cages, and all of them have sensors, right? So there's one animal per cage. So what you can see is that 24/7, you're getting data back, right? Tracking things like the movement of the animal, right? The breathing rate, and even, wheel running for activity, right? So all of this data then can easily be, pulled in and used to analyze how the animal is reacting, right, to a specific dose, of a compound that you've given it. All right, great. And so the last topic, which I think, has the most kind of relevant real life application, is machine learning. So some of the benefits and applications of machine learning, the first one is that it really helps to, again, work alongside, right, the scientist or the healthcare professional to enable faster and more accurate diagnosis, right? And so radiology and medical imaging like MRI scans, CT scans are the first examples where we really see this coming to fruition. Secondly, it helps to enable precision medicine. So precision medicine is, it's been around for a while, but, it hasn't been something, it's gaining a lot of traction now, but it's the idea that every single patient, based on our, genetics, will respond to different types of doses of different types of medications at different times, right? And so this, this concept that, for all patients who have this specific disease, we're going to give 50 milligrams of drug A, we're no longer thinking that, right? We're trying to look at patient history more, patient genetic data, right? To understand how can we provide the right dose of the right drug at the right time, even if two patients have the exact same, clinical outcomes. It's also helping to streamline patient experience, right? So with all of this COVID, a lot of, right, if you've been on a doctor's visit, that's moved to telehealth, right? Where your doctor just jumps on a Zoom call with you. There's also been efficiencies in patient flow management, right? As patients have really overwhelmed the hospital systems, how can we have, better software and management systems so that we can, direct and provide guidance and insights on which patients need which type of support for overall management of the hospital. Something else is, in the clinical trial candidates, right? So a lot of drugs, actually, you'll see they fail at the clinical stages. And this is really, pretty far along in the process, right? Clinical trials are right before it's, kind of approved by the FDA for human use. So if it fails there, it's extremely expensive, right? You didn't really have a fast failure early on. So how can we prevent that? And part of the reason why this happens is that, again, right, it kind of goes back to precision medicine. Not all patients are, based on their genetics, are going to respond, right, to drugs. And so can you use a patient's genetic information to better identify clinical trial patients, so that there is a better chance of outcome for the drug that you're developing? Because if you have a patient, right, that has a high response and one that has the opposite response, what you're going to see when you average that out is nothing, right? But that doesn't mean there weren't patients that benefited positively from this drug. And so these are the things that we're trying to surface, right, is to ensure that drugs that are impactful are making their way through the pipeline. So the second to last one is predict and monitor outbreaks. And this is a case study that I'll do, but, as we have, right, pandemics and things like that, are there, data, right, that's around in the news that we can mine and use to better understand and predict, when potentially an outbreak may be coming, right? And then lastly, for developing new medicines, right? So, how do you screen billions of compounds, right? Instead of just thinking about tens of thousands or even millions. Our capacity to explore the synthetic drug compound space is growing, but that just means, we need even more capability to screen all of them, right? And identify ones that could make it to the clinic. So how can we, and this is, obviously along with automation as well, is think about how do we efficiently screen those compounds so that we are able to pull out effective drugs. Okay, great. So some of the examples here. So the first one is, in the radiology space. So AI Doc, they have medical imaging systems, right? So they are using machine learning to be able to help radiologists better identify lesions, right, that you can see for all of these cases. As you can see, all of these are 501k. They've gotten the certification for that. They've gotten the approval. So Carius is another one. So they use sequencing to identify, if you're infected with, from a pool of, right, thousands of different pathogens, right, that could be infectious to the human body. So what you do is, starts with a blood sample that you provide. They process the specimen. They sequence your data, and in order to identify, which one or maybe multiple of the thousands of pathogens in the panel, right, they use machine learning in their analysis to generate a report. And what's really amazing about this is, 85% of them, right, they really have a 24-hour turnaround time, right? So it used to be you go to the doctor, you have symptoms, they ask for 1 or 2 specific tests to be done, and now you can be screened, right, against this entire pathogen panel, so that it's not up to the doctor, right, to try to figure out just from your symptoms alone what's happening, but that you're going to get a much more precise and accurate reading of what may be wrong with you. Okay, and this example is, also has to do with a blood test, but it's for early detection of cancer, right? So right now, if you think about the cancer process, it's typically, someone is sick, right? They go, they find that they're, they take a biopsy, right? They find something that is malignant. They start courses of therapy, or it could be you're going in for a routine test. And they notice something abnormal, right? But at that point, the cancer is, in an advanced stage, right? That's detectable because the doctor, right, is able to see that on a scan. So what Freenome wants to do is it wants to develop a blood test that can, detect really, really early markers of cancer. So even before the patient is sick, right? Because we know that the earlier the detection, the better the outcome, right? And this is true for all types of cancers. So this would change, entirely how we think about cancer and dealing with it, right? So imagine you go to your annual doctor's visit, they take a blood sample, it, is basically screened against, right, all the different types of cancers, and you're able to identify, many years, maybe even decades, right, before that cancer kind of manifests into something malignant that needs treatment. So, they're also using artificial intelligence in the back end to do this. And the last example I want to give is, what I talked about, kind of the being able to provide the first warnings of, COVID, right? So Blue Dot is a startup based in Toronto, and they're kind of referred to as an AI epidemiologist. But on New Year's Eve, their system, right? They kind of their algorithm takes in all types of data, right, from news reports and airline ticketing data, right, to look at basically the patterns, right, of movement across people. But basically, they they had an alert, right, that there could be something that was going on. And so this was really early, right? It was 9 days before the World Health Organization even, came out to notify the public that there was an outbreak in China. And so this, this really shows that some of the really impactful early examples that machine learning can be used to solve, right? It's when you have lots and lots of data that your algorithm can be used to make insights from. Okay, so that's kind of the main part of my talk. The last 2 slides I have, I'll kind of quickly go through and then open it up for Q&A. So first, I just wanted to reflect on COVID-19 and what are some of the impacts on the industry. So I'll start with the bad. So I think the bad is anything that's really non-essential has been paused, right? And that includes things like clinical trials or hospital visits, right, for people. For patients who have other potentially life-threatening diseases, right? But again, they're considered non-essential in sort of when a pandemic, right, is the baseline. I think, it is generally, if you're doing a startup, it can be a more challenging funding environment, though again, it depends, right? There's also a lot of opportunity right now. And I think the bad, what we've also seen is that we have an extremely fragile healthcare system, right? And it's, maxed out, and, we're not really able to quickly expand that capacity, right? And it's, all the way from testing to hospital systems, right, to PPE, to ventilators. So, there's lots of, you're seeing this, right, across the entire spectrum. So the good is, I think there's a huge opportunity right now for innovation. I think we've seen some of the challenges, right, in the system, and I think that makes it a really prime environment for people to think about, right? Whether you're building a startup or thinking of one, right? How can you adapt to the changing environment and to the changing needs? I think the good for me also is that there's broader interest, right, and support from the general public. I think, prior to this, there was not much, there's support, but I think there's nothing been like support like there is now, right? Because unfortunately, it has impacted every single one of us, and I think this is good. I think it will make the industry much more accountable, right? If the general public is paying attention and asking hard questions, like how come we can't quickly kind of think about capacity or scale up or the supply chain, etc. And even though it's a more challenging environment in general, which is what you hear, right, all in the news, healthcare and life sciences investors are closing, right, really big funds, right? For example, Arch and Flagship, they each closed, between the two of them, over $2.5 billion worth, right, that they can invest in new startups. And those are just 2 of the biggest ones, right? Not to mention others. And this has all been just during, right, COVID. So I think this is, kind of the silver lining is that if anything, more than ever, right, we need more innovation, in this space to be able to solve some of the challenges that I discussed. And so say, hey, you're interested, right, in kind of thinking about how do you get into this world? Great. So first, I think the number one thing I hear is like, hey, I'm not a scientist, right? And that's okay. Like, you don't need to be a scientist by training to think about, to build a healthcare and life sciences company, right? You need lots of different skill sets in a startup. I think it's helpful to have exposure to science, right? Whether, say, you worked in a lab, for a year, etc., or you have somebody in the family that's a scientist or a friend. And I only say that because you really need, and this is true, right, across the board, is that you really need a deep understanding of the problem, right, in order to understand, what are the solutions you should be building. So do you need to be a scientist and do you need to know how to pipette? No, but you absolutely need to be exposed, right, to the challenges in this field. So I think actually for everyone here that's still in school, like now is a great time, right? Universities are hotbeds of innovation. So take advantage of this opportunity, right? That you're at this university, that you're able to, communicate and talk to other people who have entrepreneurial mindsets, and that you're able to discuss, problems with them and get their opinion on it. Something else that's really great, I think, is, joining a community, right? Such as an accelerator and incubator, right? And I know Viterbi has a startup garage, and there's several others that I work with. And again, the one that you choose really depends on your needs, right? Some of them provide, equity or funding. Others are more mentorship, right? Either on the business or the technical side. So you have to figure out, kind of where the gaps are for your company, right? And then go from there to try to understand what types of program would be best suited for you. This is just true in general, right? Is, to kind of network and to build your network, right, of mentors and advisors that are experienced in this space. If you're building a startup, there's going to be lots of things you don't know. But the good news is there's lots of people that have gone through, right, similar, challenges that are more than happy to share their experience. So reach out to people, right? If people don't respond or say no, that's okay. That's for every, right, in order to get a yes, you're going to get many no's. But you have to make the effort to go out there. I would say lastly, this is kind of cliche, but do something you love, right? Healthcare life sciences startups are really, they can be really long-term commitments. We are, there's technology and we're accelerating how some of the things, how to speed up some of the things we're doing, right? But a lot of, kind of the foundation of what needs to be done in terms of, dealing with clinical trials and human patients, the nature of it is that it's going to be much more of a long-term commitment than building like a software app, right? So make sure it's something you love, right? And that, it's not, in it for, the money or something else that will all come along, with it. But as long as you're doing something you love, you'll never, regret the time and energy that you spent on doing something. Great. So here is my email. If any of you have any, questions or want to connect with me afterwards, please don't, hesitate to reach out. I'm more than happy to meet with you, chat with some of you if you have any questions around, anything related to my background or startups in general. And we have a few minutes still for questions, so.
Yes, we have more time for questions. I'm looking at my group of students who I think should pop in and ask any questions. Do I hear someone? Am I being hopeful? I guess I don't have necessarily a question, but one of the aspects of kind of moving forward in healthcare is in that democratization of healthcare. We all have people in our families who are home and, are not necessarily the best of health, and the idea of them like being in a hospital or being taken care of away from home, sometimes just like emotionally challenging, and having more ways to keep them healthy and safe in the comforts of their own home is something that speaks to me, and I'm sure speaks to many people who have, grandparents, great-grandparents, parents. And I'm just wondering, do you see any really great trends in that area when it comes to kind of like home health care for the recently elderly, right? That where it's obvious that you don't necessarily need to be at a hospital to monitor, and that the home would be a better place to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I see, a lot of sort of trends in, the telehealth space, but also in remote monitoring, right? So in the telehealth space, I think, it's kind of been, there's lots of companies that are great at being able to do sort of primary care, right? But again, that's going to be very limited, right, to, what you can diagnose with your computer or camera, right? A lot of it is going to have to be lab tests, et cetera. So where I see this going is probably coupling of, the ability of telehealth with, say, labs, right, that are able to come to your house, to grab, say, a blood sample, et cetera, right? So then you are really able to get that, sort of more comprehensive care from home. The second area is, remote monitoring, right? And traditionally this has been more in the space of, hey, you go get a procedure, right, at the hospital. We know a lot of people don't have great adherence, right, to, medication or, other things that they may need to do in order to stay healthy. And so what I see that is, a natural extension of that, right, in terms of being able to better monitor patients at home. through technology, right? So doctors being, able to take care of them, doctors being able to, take care of them, but also, it goes back to also that kind of health data interoperability, right? How can we enable patients to have much more control over their own health data, right? Right now, a lot of it still resides, right, with the medical systems. You can kind of access it, but you don't really control it, right? And you aren't really able to sort of collect, all from all the different data sources, right? Again, so there, I also see companies there, trying to improve that experience, and providing, say, an app, right, where you can collect all your information, even if it's just dental, vision, and medical, right? But, as you get elderly, you're going to see lots of different, doctors, right, that are specialists. And again, they may not be under, using the same software, right, for your electronic health records. So how do we put the care of the patient sort of more back in the hands of the patient or their caregiver rather than, at the doctor?
I feel like I asked a similar question about kind of having a centralized point for that's customer facing for healthcare, to Steve last week, because he's in fintech, and like insurance also plays such a huge part of that kind of visibility issue, where it's, you are making these appointments and you're having all of these tests, and you're just kind of hoping that your insurance is covering it, and understanding the financial aspect of healthcare, which is also part of the reason why I think people hesitate to even get treatment in the first place, or to participate afterwards. So yeah, I do think that centralization of data, and then also kind of making it available to the consumer, is something that I'm desperately waiting for and wishing.
Yeah, I think more transparency, obviously, into, right, as you mentioned, pricing and coverage, and all of that. But again, I think, there is going to be much more, I hope, accountability, right, because of, COVID, right? And we're really starting to sort of see, some of the really tenuous points, that, to sort of the healthcare system, right, at the brink of being at capacity, right, and what that means. And I think we could have never really imagined that for a country like the US. And so again, how do we, have, improvements there?
Yeah.
So I think Zara, is that a hand raise?
Yeah, true.
Hey, Zara.
Hey.
Thanks for raising your hand.
I'm from Iran, 8 a.m. And I'm really happy. Thank you. And thank you for having such a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I thought maybe I have to jump in and show up and ask a question, because you were waiting for something.
Oh, great. I love it. Peer pressure is the best.
Actually, thank you. Actually, I'm working within a team now, using the images to diagnose the COVID-19 patients. But actually, as you mentioned, we are confronting many kind of difficulties, especially when we are just raising this idea of using the AI. Many doctors and healthcare are afraid that this technology is going to replace their place. So also one other complications while doing this was the ethics behind the using of AI in healthcare. So I wanted to ask about your idea about the future of ethics in using AI in the healthcare. And also the second question I had was about the opportunities that you think AI and machine learning is going to bring for us in neuroscience. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So the first one I think is around, ethical considerations. I think, yeah, we definitely need to kind of get ahead of that, right, before we start using it. We see things like, other types of machine learning, right, and face recognition, where there could be, there could just be general sort of data biases, right? So I don't think this is anything that's solved. But I do think there are, international sort of organizations who are looking at this. But I think it's also the responsibility, right, of every single founder or company who's working on this, right? To make sure that, the data that you're using and the technology that you're generating, there is, a social responsibility to make sure that it's being used in, the appropriate way that's possible. In terms of neuroscience, yeah, neuroscience is a hard one. There's, I think, a lot of actually, some pharma companies have kind of recently withdrawn from neuroscience. I think it's just been a problem that has seemed to be a little bit, intractable, right? Even though they're horrible diseases, that manifest. But I do think there are, improvements in kind of thinking about how we map the brain, right? Using machine learning to better understand how different components of the brain operate, right? Because I think it's still, a huge black box to everyone, right? I think even for Alzheimer's, right? As an example, there's still a lot of research that needs to happen, right? We don't really understand if it's plaque formation, right? If that's causation or just corollary. Some people actually a while ago, I don't know if this is still the case, but there was a research article from a lab that came out that thought, Alzheimer's was actually potentially due to remnants of a viral infection, right? And that humans who weren't able to clear that infection properly, the remnants of those proteins, right, in the brain was actually causing it. So, I think machine learning for neuroscience, I want to believe personally that, there's a lot of potential there. And I think it can be anywhere from the R&D side, right, in terms of even just, thinking about the different possibilities that we test, right? Again, science right now is so targeted, right, because we're limited in resource. But, imagine you had through AWS, unlimited computing capability, right? What are all of the different simulations and modeling you can do to try to understand, right, what's the underlying cause or the target of Alzheimer's? Because once you have a target, right, then you can start developing drugs towards it to try to understand how to impact that. But yeah, neuro diseases are one of the more kind of intractable problems. And yeah, I see a lot of companies working on it, so I'm hopeful.
Thank you very much for your explanations.
Yeah. It's a great question. Questions? Okay, we're right at the end of time. Actually, we're a little over time, but that's fine because we love talking to you. In fact, I'm going to formally invite you to come speak with us again and again. So I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to talk about the healthcare field. I know that as engineers, there are tons of solutions in this particular area that are really relevant right now. And so it's such a big topic and it's a huge one to tackle, and it also has its inherent complications. But I appreciate how you broke down all of the different great areas that these students can get excited about. So thank you again for coming.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, thanks everyone for spending an hour with me. Again, if you have any questions or want to connect, feel free to shoot me an email.
All right, and we'll see the students for Storytelling Wednesday on Wednesday. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.